Hi everyone, we might kick things off. Welcome to our second webinar of the NT Ag webinar series. Thanks very much for joining us today. We'll kick things off. I'll hand over to Dr. Warren Hunt, the Manager of Agricultural Policy and Analysis today, to give us a presentation on the Northern Territory Hemp Industry Act and regulating industry hemp production in the NT. All right, go for it, Warren.
G'day. Look, my name is Warren Hunt. Look, for those of you who don't know me, I work in the area of agricultural policy and analysis. A few years back, I think it was the second half of 2014, there was an article that appeared on Landline regarding industrial hemp. Now, hemp has been regulated in Australia for commercial use for some years now, up to 20 years and some close to 20 years in some jurisdictions. But that's largely been for fibre purposes. What was changing then is that there was an impetus nationwide, and it's a global impetus to actually more fully utilise this plant. But the big driver in Australia was to utilise industrial hemp for feed production type purposes. Hemp produces a grain, and that grain can be squeezed for oil. So in 2017, that became reality. Feed Standards Australia New Zealand opened up the prospect for, they legalised hemp as a food in both our nations. That was a game changer for the hemp industry because, frankly, the fibre industry at this point is a fairly marginal proposition, whereas based on the studies that I've done, the scoping I've done, the whole food side of the equation is potentially much more lucrative. So in 2017, I was given the charge of drafting an industry act, a bill, and then supporting regulations to make a hemp industry live here in the Northern Territory. That's now in a reality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the controlling instruments around the hemp sector in Northern Territory. We're the last jurisdiction in Australia to bring in hemp legislation and supporting regulations. But we've got a framework here, and we've got a positioning here that could work to the Territory's advantage. So, right. Just okay. Right. So the Northern Territory Hemp Industry Act commenced on the 6th of May 2020, and the associated regulations. Now, the objectives of the Act are basically to set out a licensing system for cultivation, possession, supply, research and processing of hemp. There are a number of prohibitions in this legislation. Also detailed are the enforcement provisions, a series of offences, and the administration around a whole lot of miscellaneous arrangements with regards to setting up regulations and giving the powers to actually to the chief executive to write conditions under licensing, etc. So, what is industrial hemp? What can you use it for? We're pretty much bound at this point under the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which binds us to use industrial hemp for either food or fibre purposes. The fibre purposes, as you might see with that picture up on the right-hand side of your screen, hemp has an epidermis on the stems, which is known as the bast. And the bast is used typically for a whole range of textile uses, composites, etc. You'd be familiar with hemp rope or hemp line if you are a mariner. In fact, the Royal Navy, 300 years dominated the world's oceans based on hemp line and hemp sail, and it was actually one of the resource issues, principal reasons why they engaged in the Crimean War. That was to secure their hemp supply out of Ukraine. So then there's the other side, the inner part of the stem of hemp, which is hurd. Okay, it's the pith, it's the pithy core of the plant stem, and that core is it can be used for a range of different purposes, and great value in animal bedding, etc. So hemp grain can be put to a lot of uses, either as a whole grain for food. It can be processed and into flour. It can be squeezed for oil. It can be fermented to make products such as beer. All right. Also squeezed for a whole lot of cosmetic issues too, products as well, I should say. Um, but that's not the only thing you can do with hemp. So the flower heads of hemp, it's cannabis. It's we're dealing with the cannabis species here. It's just low THC hemp. Can be also utilised for extracting a whole heap of other compounds. There's nearly 100 different cannabinoids out there, and only one of them is psychoactive, which is THC delta 9. The rest of the cannabinoids are largely inert. They're non-psychoactive, and as we're learning, a number of them may have certain beneficial therapeutic qualities, and there's a whole potential range of uses for those different cannabinoids, CBDs, CBNs, as well as terpenes. Now, terpenes are typically the compound that gives hemp its unique smells or flavours, and you can see terpenes in a practical sense are used in the likes of deodorizers and things like that. So essential oils, sort of for putting in an oil burner, etc. So at this point, though, we can't lawfully extract under our licence provisions here in the Northern Territory. Under our legislation, we can't extract those products unless we're actually working under a medicinal licence at the federal level. Okay, there's two main controlling instruments in Australia when it comes to the cannabis species. One of them is the industrial type uses across the various jurisdictions for food or fibre purposes, and the other is medicinal. Let's not confuse them. The medicinal is a federal act, and people can extract. Individuals, companies can extract different compounds from the plant for use in a whole different lot of purposes in the medicinal field. So what's different with regards to our legislation than what's different when compared with other jurisdictions around the country? Firstly, in the Northern Territory, we have an approved varieties list. No other jurisdiction has that in the country. The list is aimed at trying to provide a level of control, and through that a level of confidence and protection or security for our farmers in the Northern Territory. Last thing we want is for our farmers to potentially get lumbered with varieties that or germplasm that could see them deliver, grow a crop that's going to exceed the 1% threshold. Okay, that's not what we want. So we're generating an approved varieties list. There's one set up already, and that can be added to through our regulatory processes and approved by the CE. Varieties that will consistently yield less than 1%. We're also we're going to have 5-year licenses. Many of the other jurisdictions are less than that. When it comes to transporting material, there'll be consignment notes. In other words, so when people harvest a crop, whether it's for food production service purposes or whether it's for propagation purposes, that grain will be accompanied by a consignment note or a waybill. So there's no confusion with people moving this type of material. So if they get pulled up on the road, there is actually a traceability around the origins of the consignment. It's the same thing like if people, researchers might be moving plants from point A to point B. There's been situations interstate where people working for research companies with a utility load or a truckload of cannabis plants in the back, get pulled up on the highway by the police, and you can understand that it would be, there's a level of complexity there. So we're the first jurisdiction in the country to actually work with a consignment note. So we will be sharing our database with the police of everyone who's licensed within our system. Police that do actually have veto powers within our legislation to refuse to issue licenses to certain individuals. So another characteristic of our legislation is we'll have a minimum land area for commercial cropping. That's 2 hectares. This is modelled off what they do in Canada. Canada, they have a minimum land area of 4 hectares. The whole objective of this is about trying to have a manageable number of licenses to regulate. In some jurisdictions, or no other jurisdiction has a minimum land area, and some jurisdictions have had the complexity of 80% of their licenses will just be smallholders who will have a hemp patch that might be as big as a tennis court in their backyard or something like that. Profoundly difficult to manage as a regulator. The other characteristic is that we got a clear statement of no feeding of the leaf material to stock at this point until we can actually get some national rulings on maximum residue levels and safety with regards to feeding this plant to stock. We know that both the grain and the leaf material is highly nutritious. The question is the residue levels of feeding the leaf, the residue risks of feeding leaf material to stock at this point has not been properly quantified. So who's eligible to apply for a license here in the Northern Territory? So if you're an applicant, you must be of good repute in terms of character, honesty, and integrity. You've got to have a genuine reason why you want to actually have a license. So if you want to do some research, you've actually got to present a tangible case that, hey, you're going to do some research. And you've got to live in Australia, ordinarily that is, and you can't be subject to any bankruptcy action. There are a number of conditions that license holders must meet, and there's additional conditions that can be imposed on a license as well. So if you get a license and there's any change to your circumstances or change to the way in which you are going to be cultivating that crop or whatever, regulator needs to know about it. Government needs to know when you intend to plant that crop. The reason being is that the last thing we need is a call from the police saying, well, we're going to put in a raid, or we need to, or we find out that the police have put in a raid on a particular person when they might have been carrying out perfectly legitimate activities under our license. So the whole point of the process is that we actually got a traceability, a record of, well, Farmer Joe's put in a crop at this location, and the police will then contact us if they should, receive any alerts from the general public that someone's growing cannabis, and we can actually calm their fears by saying, well, actually, there's a regulated low THC crop growing at the location that you've reported, so there's no need to conduct a raid. Farmers or researchers will be required to annually report on activities carried out under the licence, and as I also said before, consignment notices will have to be accompany any material being supplied, and you can only use industrial hemp material supplied by a person authorised to do so under the NT Act or a corresponding law interstate. In other words, you can only source seed, you can only source or germplasm in general from other people who have a license to work in industrial hemp, or at least there's a line of control. Potentially, we could also be drawing some material from the medicinal side of the industry as well, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Conditions that may apply to individual licenses. Needs to be labelling. The crop residue has to be destroyed in terms of any volunteer plants. People have to keep records on when they sow, harvest, and yields and that sort of thing. And if there's any theft of the seed or anything else like that, police need to be notified. Commercial license, $1,250 over 5 years. Research licenses, two types. Class A, that's for doing research with just industrial hemp lines, anything that's less than 1% THC. And Class B licenses for those who are looking to conduct research with hemp for industrial hemp purposes, but which might include cannabis lines with THCs greater than 1%. The rationale for this is that if a particular line of high THC has characteristics that might be beneficial to the industrial hemp business, for instance, it might be dwarfism or high grain yield or something like that, they will incorporate that into a breeding program, then this Class B research license allows that to be considered. Okay, so so there's a number of parameters there. So the licenses allow for research, instruction, analysis, or study. So that covers the department as well if they want to do any demonstration work. So they're the relative values of the research licenses there at the bottom of the page. So we have a hemp compliance branch now within the department, and they maintain the approved varieties list and also respond to any inquiries around licensing. The NT department is also represented on the Australian Industrial Hemp Regulators Network. This meets every 6 months in a different host state. It's been in existence since February 2018. The objectives are to coordinate our national regulatory efforts to make sure we're in some level of harmony, and to have safe, secure and compliant cultivation across the board. And really, even though they're in a regulatory function, to also promote sustainable development of this new industry in Australia. That's it. Yeah, just for your benefit, what you're looking at there is a male plant in that photo, and you'll see the bee on the male flowers there after the pollen. It's a prolific producer of pollen, industrial hemp, and it's open air pollinated. It's a dioecious crop, largely speaking. There are some monoecious varieties, but so you've got male plants and you've got female plants. As you can see there, they're all fertilised female plants. A lot of those ones, those big flower heads sticking up there in that photo. Question is there, what's of relevance to the North? How is this of relevance to the Northern Territory? There's a bit of speculation in here, but it's what you'd say gauged speculation. It's considered. Territory's got some geospatial and climatic advantages that might be beneficial and that could be exploited. We may be able to set ourselves up as a viable seed production zone to supply seed to Southern Australia or even internationally of different varieties. This is because we've got large distances between farms. We've got large distances between farming precincts. As I said, it's an open air pollinated crop. And the last thing you want if you're a seed grower of one variety is to have another variety growing in close proximity. It leads to contamination. Irrigated hemp crops with uninterrupted sunlight will grow quicker here too, as during our dry season, and it may be possible to get 2 seed crops per annum. So really, I think we're looking at an irrigated cropping system for our industrial hemp. But to be fair, we need to do a lot more research. We're very much in the infancy with industrial hemp in the Northern Territory and indeed Australia overall. And at the global level, it's an industry that's pretty much been prohibited for 80 years, and there's a lot of research still to happen. So there's been a wide range of people and industry organisations associated with hemp and just farming in general that have been consulted in the development of this legislation. And at the moment, the only legal recreational use of hemp will be this stuff. That's the beer you can make out of it. So that's it from me, and I'm happy to field a few questions in due course.